Hi, welcome to another edition of Inside Crisis. I'm Gordon Greer. Grief is an experience that inevitably impacts every workplace. After all, where there are humans, there is inevitably grief. Sometimes the grief is brought to work from home. Sometimes the grief originates at work and the bearer takes it home with them. Sometimes the loss is on an organizational rather than a personal level. Let's talk about how we can best assist workers manage their grief. The rule of thumb is that less is more. When faced with the sorrow and helplessness that accompanies grief, we often feel compelled to muster a more considerable response. We often don't know exactly what to say or do, but we are certain that it must approximate or be commensurate to the pain. This is consistent with the former conventional wisdom concerning grief, that one must feel and talk about everything fully, that you can only achieve healing if you navigate through stages, and that you must break free from the person or thing you lost. Grief was for a time more or less pathologized. More was less. Let me explain what I mean by less is more. It reminds me of the evolution of CPR over the years. CPR was much more involved in the 1980s when I remember practicing life-saving technique on resuscitator Annie. With the benefit of research and the desire to eliminate instances of Good Samaritans hesitating to perform CPR out of intimidation, CPR has gradually become more simplified. Now it's more or less compressions with limited accompanying breaths. Grief is not very different. We've learned a lot about grief in recent decades, and we also want people to feel comfortable to offer assistance for themselves and others without fear of doing it incorrectly. Conventional wisdom has changed and has become better informed by research. What we've realized is that grief is the most natural of experiences. The grief experience is as individualized as a fingerprint, and there is no evidence to support actual stages of grieving or forcing oneself to feel and talk about most or all aspects of a loss. Actually, some people benefit from emotional suppression to an extent. We also know that it is not always healthier to distance oneself from the lost object or person. Sometimes communicating with a deceased loved one for years after their death can be perfectly healthy. The bottom line is that there are few hard set rules. This is not math, just the opposite. It's more essay. Maybe the only rule involves self-destruction. We draw the line there with regard to stating that there is no wrong way to grieve. Suicide, drugs, gross decompensation, or violence are not sanctioned ways to grieve. The new conventional wisdom suggests three approaches. One, that it is important to be present and validate the individualized path of grief. Grief is actually like topography, totally unique, and each grieving individual sets out on their own path. Sometimes we walk with them, and sometimes they walk alone. Sometimes they crawl or sit for a while. 2, we can provide comfort and company. This involves simply being present, even if you don't talk, and doing helpful practical things for them as opposed to asking them to bear the burden of formulating ideas of how you can help. A mere offer to help is not usually very useful and puts the onus on them. We can understand that grieving is like having a virus. There is no antibiotic that will cure the grief. Just time, care, and comfort. The difference between an actual virus and grief, of course, is that we don't seek out meaning with a virus. And 3, grieving operates according to the principle of oscillation. All life operates according to this law. Breathing, sleep cycles, tides. Rather than stages as Kubler-Ross suggested, there is liberation in oscillating between immersion in loss and restoration. One needn't give up either experience, and like a dial on a radio, one can visit both states of being at the individual's discretion and the circumstances involved. This is called the dual process model. With the dual process model, one could conceivably wake up in the morning feeling immobilized with sadness after a loss, and allow themselves to feel the abject devastation as they flip through a photo album, and then oscillate to showering, going into work, and laughing with coworkers about the absurd aspects of life. Sometimes we are drawn to one of the poles outlined in the model and sometimes we may seek out one intentionally. Sometimes less is more. Sometimes we just need to get out of our own way. Thanks for watching this edition of Inside Crisis.